Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we are going to spend some time in a world that most of humanity knew for thousands of years, but which has almost completely disappeared from everyday life. A world where winter arrived not with the touch of a thermostat, but with the gathering of firewood, where families measured warmth by the size of a hearth, where frost formed on bedroom windows, and where the simple glow of a fire could transform an entire evening. For most of human history, surviving winter was not something that happened quietly in the background. It shaped homes, routines, communities, and even the way people slept. Tonight, we'll move slowly through that world together. There is nothing to remember, nothing to study, and nowhere you need to be. Simply settle in, get comfortable, and allow your mind to wander through another time. And so, as the first cold evening settles over the landscape, let us begin. The first thing people noticed was not the snow, it was the cold. There is a particular evening that comes every year. It arrives without announcement. You step outside in the late afternoon, and the air has changed. Not simply grown cooler, but changed. Thinner, somehow, with a quality that settles against the skin differently than the air of summer or even early autumn. Something in it says, "This is the beginning." For most of human history, that evening was not a minor inconvenience managed with a thermostat. It was the opening of a long season that would reorganize everything: what you ate, where you slept, how you moved through your house, how close you sat to the people you lived with. Winter was not weather outside, winter came inside. We have largely forgotten what that feels like. We move between our heated cars and our heated offices and our heated homes, and winter touches us mostly at the edges. A cold walk, a scraping of ice from a windshield, a moment of shock when we first step out the door. But for the people we are going to follow tonight, winter was not something that happened at the edges. It was the whole season, felt in the bones, managed with fire, and endured together. This is a quiet journey. We are going to move slowly through time, visiting ordinary homes and ordinary people, farmers and merchants, children and grandmothers, soldiers on cold frontiers, and families gathered around small fires. We are not going to hurry. There is nowhere to be tonight except here, in the long winter darkness, listening. Let us begin at the beginning, with the first cold evening. Imagine a house. Not any particular house, but a kind of house that existed for thousands of years, in various forms across the northern world. Stone walls or timber walls or walls of wattle and daub, a floor of stone or beaten earth or rough wooden planking, a roof that keeps out rain and snow, but not the cold that seeps through every gap. Windows that are small and often unglazed, or glazed only with oiled cloth or thin scraped horn, because glass was expensive and even glass let the cold through. On this first cold evening the fire has been burning since morning, as it burns every day. But tonight it means something more. Tonight the person tending it, let us say a woman, somewhere in northern England in the early 14th century, notices that the heat from the hearth does not reach the far corner of the room the way it did in October. She can feel it. The room has a different quality now. There is a warmth at her back when she faces the fire, and a cold at her back when she turns away from it. She does not think of this as a crisis. She has known this every winter of her life. She simply begins to adjust, pulling a stool a little closer to the fire adding a log before she would normally need to, wrapping a length of rough wool around her shoulders. Her children, playing on the floor near the hearth, shift inward toward the warmth without being asked. The dog, who has been sleeping in the doorway, moves deeper into the room. Outside, the sky is a deep, cold blue above the tree line. The last light is going. By the time it is fully dark, the temperature will drop another several degrees, and there will be frost by morning. The fire is everything now. There is something very old about that sentence, something that goes back past the Middle Ages, past Rome, past any civilization we can name, back to the first human beings who learned to keep a flame alive through the night. The fire is everything. It gives light, it gives heat, it cooks the food, it dries the wet wool and the wet boots, it keeps the darkness at a distance. Without it, the night is formless and cold and frightening. And so, on this first cold evening, as on every cold evening that will follow, for the next 4 or 5 months, the fire is fed and tended and watched over. The family gathers around it. The room contracts to the size of the firelight. The smell of the room is specific and unrepeatable, smoke from burning oak or pine or peat, depending on where you are, the faint, animal smell of wool clothing that is never quite fully dry, the grease of tallow candles beginning to be lit one by one, something cooking over the fire, a pot of thick grain porridge, or a piece of salt meat loosening in hot water. These smells do not drift in through a vent. They are the smell of the room. The room holds them, the way the walls hold the cold. This is where winter begins. Not in the wind, not in the calendar, but in this small sensory shift. The room contracting, the fire mattering more, the smell of smoke and wool and tallow becoming the smell of the season itself. It will be this way for months. To understand winter before central heating, you have to understand something about the architecture of cold. Houses in the pre-modern world were not designed as sealed thermal containers. They were built with the assumption that cold would come inside, and they were organized around that fact. In medieval Europe, the great hall of a manor house was just that, a great hall, high-ceilinged, open to the rafters, with a fire burning in the middle of the floor or in a large hearth against one wall. The fire heated the room imperfectly. People near it were warm, sometimes too warm. People at the far end were cold. The heat rose to the ceiling and escaped through the smoke hole or up the chimney, and the cold air flowed in to replace it along the floor. Poorer homes were smaller and therefore slightly easier to heat, but they lacked insulation, their walls were thin, and their windows, where they had them, were often little more than wooden shutters over openings in the wall. When the shutters were open, there was light and air. When they were closed, there was warmth and darkness. What both wealthy and poor households shared was the understanding that warmth was local, not general. You did not heat a house, you heated a spot. You heated yourself within a room in the way you might warm your hands over a candle, by being close to the source, by positioning yourself correctly, by wearing enough layers that your own body could do some of the work. Wealthier medieval households developed elegant responses to this problem. Wood paneling on the interior of stone walls reduced the chill that radiated from the stone. Tapestries served the same function, beautiful, yes, but also insulating, trapping a layer of air between the cold wall and the warmer room. Heavy curtains divided large spaces into smaller ones. In northern Germany and Scandinavia, enclosed tile stoves, Kacheloven, became a remarkable domestic technology designed to absorb heat slowly and radiate it evenly over many hours, long after the fire itself had died down. These stoves could make a room genuinely, sustainably warm, but they required good tile work, sufficient fuel, and careful management. They were not available to everyone. For many households, particularly in rural areas, warmth still meant fire, and fire still meant smoke, and smoke still meant that the air in the room was never quite clean. In colonial America, the fireplace was the organizing center of the home in a way that is difficult to overstate. Mount Vernon and homes like it had multiple fireplaces, but even so, the warmth was uneven. A room with a fireplace burning steadily could be comfortable near the fire and genuinely cold at the far wall. A room without a fireplace was simply a cold room, used for storage or for sleeping in summer, but largely abandoned to winter. The colonial household organized its daily life around the hearth in the most literal sense. Meals were cooked there, children did their lessons there, women spun and sewed there, men read or did accounts there. The fire was not a background feature. It was the place where life happened, because it was the warm place, and winter made warm places precious. Think for a moment about what this meant for the layout of a day. You woke in a cold room. The fire, if it had been banked overnight with ash to keep coals alive, needed to be stirred back to life. The first task of morning was making fire, or, in households with servants, the first task was making sure a servant had made fire before the family rose. Either way, before any food could be cooked, before any warmth could be felt, before the day could properly begin, there was the fire to attend to. Then the fire had to be fed all day. Firewood was not a passive resource that sat in a pile and waited. It had to be selected, carried in, placed correctly, managed so it burned efficiently without consuming itself too quickly or collapsing into a cold heap of ash. Tending the fire was a continuous, daily domestic labor that everyone in the household participated in and that everyone depended on. In the evening, when the fire was allowed to die down, the house cooled quickly. Stone walls and earthen floors gave back the cold they had absorbed all day. The family moved toward the fire for the last hours of light. And then, when it was time to sleep, the fire was banked. The candles were extinguished, and people went to bed in rooms that had already begun their nightly return to the temperature of the outside air. Houses were built around fire because fire was not a luxury. Fire was the difference between a livable winter and an unbearable one. Every architectural choice, the placement of windows, the height of ceilings, the use of curtains and panelling and thick rugs, was at least partly a response to the fact that cold came inside, and that the only way to push it back was to put a flame between yourself and the dark. Of all the things that winter changed before modern heating, perhaps the most intimate was sleep. We tend to think of sleep as a private, uniform experience. You lie down, you become warm, you drift off. But for most of human history, sleep in winter was something you prepared for the way you might prepare for a journey. You needed the right equipment. You needed a strategy. You needed to know what you were doing. The bed itself was the first line of defense. In wealthy households, a bed was not merely a mattress on a frame. It was an enclosed structure. a four-poster bed with heavy curtains on all four sides that could be drawn closed at night, creating a small personal room within the room, trapping body heat inside the curtains and keeping the cold air of the chamber at bay. Inside those curtains, with a wool mattress below and wool blankets above, and perhaps a feather or down covering if the household could afford one, it was genuinely possible to be warm. The transition from the cold room to the warm bed was managed with care. A bed warming pan, a long-handled pan of beaten copper or brass filled with hot coals or heated stones wrapped in cloth, was slid between the sheets before you got in, warming the linen that would otherwise feel like cold water against the skin. In some households, servants did this. In others, the housewife did it herself. In either case, it was a deliberate, attentive act, preparing the sleeping place the way you might prepare a small refuge. Even with a warming pan, the first moments in bed had a particular sensation. The shock of linen that had lost its warmth at the edges, the careful movement inward toward the pre-warmed centre, the slow accumulation of body heat under the covers. Then, gradually, the curtains closed around you, and the small private climate of the bed took over. The noise of the house faded. The cold, for the moment, was somewhere else. But the cold was not gone. On a truly bitter night, you could wake in the small hours to find your breath visible even inside the bed curtains, or to hear the fire in the grate, if there was one in your room, hissing and settling into ash. The chamber itself was dropping toward the temperature of the outside air. Condensation could form on the inner surfaces of windows. Water left in a jug overnight could freeze by morning. For ordinary people without curtained beds, for the rural poor, for servants, for the enslaved, for children sleeping in lofts, the night was simpler and colder. A straw pallet on the floor, a rough blanket or two, or a pile of old clothes. In the worst conditions, a single room with multiple people sleeping together, sharing body heat as the fire went out. The smell of that room, several people, wool and linen that had not been washed recently, the dying fire, the cold stone walls, would have been thick and specific. There is a concept among historians of sleep called segmented sleep, the idea that before artificial lighting became widespread, many people slept in two distinct phases. A first sleep that began shortly after dark and lasted several hours, then a period of waking in the middle of the night, and then a second sleep that lasted until dawn. This middle-of-the-night waking was apparently quite ordinary. People prayed, had quiet conversations, made love, tended the fire, walked around the house. It was not insomnia. It was simply a different relationship with night-time. In winter, that middle waking must have had a particular quality. The fire would have died down or been tended if it was cold enough. The house was at its coldest point, just before the coldest hour of the night. The world outside was still and dark and silent in the way that winter silence is distinct from summer silence, denser, heavier, as if the cold has pressed down on all sound and held it still. Inside, the small household breathed in the dark. Getting up in that middle waking required a kind of courage. Stepping out of the warmth of bed into a room that was perhaps 40 degrees or colder, bare feet on stone or earth, demanded a certain resolve. People managed it by keeping clothing close to the bed, by moving quickly and purposefully, by getting to the fire or the chamber pot and back to bed as efficiently as possible. And then, back under the covers, pulling the blankets up, feeling the cold of the sheets where the body warmth had dissipated, and slowly, slowly warming again. This was the rhythm of winter nights for most of human history. Not one long unbroken sleep, but a night in two halves, with the cold at the centre of it managed and endured and finally surrendered to again. Morning, when it came, brought its own particular sensation. The fire needed to be rebuilt. The room was at its coldest. Breath was visible in the air. Dressing was done quickly without ceremony. The first priority was getting the fire going, getting something warm, a drink of heated ale or cider or water with herbs into the body. The day did not begin gently. It began in the cold, with deliberate movement toward warmth. There is a particular quality to a winter evening in a small house with children. It is not a quiet quality. Children are rarely quiet, but there is a density to it, a closeness, a way that the cold outside makes the interior feel more inhabited. Everyone is present, everyone is in the same room, or nearly so, because the room with the fire is the only room that is warm enough for sustained activity. Imagine a colonial American family in, say, the 1740s. There are 6 people in a house of 3 rooms. The main room holds the hearth, and on a December evening all 6 of them are in it. The father is reading by the fire or repairing something, a harness, a tool that needs attention before tomorrow. The mother is spinning, her wheel making its continuous low hum. The older children are doing some form of work, carding wool, mending cloth, sewing the rough seams of a garment that will be worn through the winter. The youngest children, too small to work usefully, are playing on the floor near the fire, as close to it as they dare. The candles, tallow candles smelling faintly of animal fat, give off a warm but limited light. The circle of usable visibility is small. Reading and sewing must be done close to the flame. The corners of the room are in shadow. If you look up at the ceiling, you can see the smoke from the fire and the candles gathering in the high air, giving the room a slight haze that is so familiar it goes unnoticed. This closeness had effects that we rarely think about now. Families who lived this way spent winter evenings in a proximity that modern families seldom experience. They talked, or they were quiet together, or they told stories. The long winter evenings before electricity were genuinely long. Darkness came early, sometimes by 4 in the afternoon, and there was nothing to do with the darkness but be in it, managing it with fire and candlelight. Stories were part of this. In many cultures, winter was specifically the season of storytelling, the time when the long evenings made it possible, and the cold outside made the warm interior feel like a gift. The Norse tradition of sitting close together on long winter nights and hearing old stories, the Celtic tradition of winter as the season when the veil between worlds was thin and old tales had more weight. The Slavic tradition of household spirits and winter tales told beside the stove. These were not only entertainment, they were a way of making the darkness useful, filling it with voices and images that could be carried to bed. Children in these households learned early to read the fire, to feel the difference between a well-built blaze and a failing one, to know when to add wood and when to leave it alone. They learned the smell of different kinds of fuel, oak, which burned slow and even, pine, which burned fast and bright and sent sparks, peat, which burned with a distinctive earthy smell and left a particular kind of ash. These were not lessons taught formally. They were absorbed through proximity and repetition, the way language is absorbed. Bedtime in winter was a small production. The children needed to be warm enough to sleep, which meant extra layers, extra blankets, and sometimes a warming stone, a rounded river stone heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth placed at the foot of the bed. The youngest children slept together for warmth or in the same room as parents. The older children went to their own cold chambers with candles and the admonition to be quick about it. Illness was a constant concern. Children who were already prone to coughs and chills in the cold months were watched more carefully, kept closer to the fire, given warm drinks and poultices and whatever the household knew of remedies. There was no clear line between cold weather and sickness. They were experienced as related, intertwined, the cold making the body more vulnerable to whatever was going around. Grandparents in these households occupied a particular position. They were the people who knew the most winter lore, how to read the sky for coming cold, how to manage provisions, what to do when the fuel was running low. They were also often the most vulnerable to the cold, and so they sat closest to the fire. There is something right about that image. The eldest person in the house nearest the warmth, surrounded by children. The long winter nights were not wasted. They were when families repaired what was broken, made what was needed, talked about what was coming. They were when knowledge moved from one generation to the next, not in schools, but in the small, warm circle of the fire. Step outside the house for a moment, step out into the village on a night in January, somewhere in northern Europe, in a century before machines and railways. Step out and feel what winter felt like at the scale of a community. Snow has a particular effect on sound that is unlike anything else in nature. It absorbs it. A village under heavy snow is not simply quiet, it is muffled, hushed, as though the landscape has drawn a heavy fabric over itself. The ordinary sounds of a working settlement, dogs, cartwheels, voices, the knock of tools, are dampened almost to nothing. What remains is the creak of tree branches under the weight of ice, the occasional low moan of wind through the eaves, and the far-off bark of something in the dark. From the outside, those houses look different in winter. They look more enclosed in themselves. The light from their windows, warm amber or yellow from fire and candle, seems brighter against the white of the snow and the dark of the sky. Smoke rises straight up from the chimneys on still nights, or tilts in a long, low arc when there is wind. Each chimney is a signal. There are people here, and they have fire. In a medieval village, the community's relationship with winter was collective in ways that individual households could not manage alone. The common granary held the reserves of food that would carry everyone through to spring. The common pasture had been closed since autumn. Livestock that could not be fed through the winter had been slaughtered at Martinmas around early November, and their meat salted, smoked, pickled, or frozen in the cold air. What remained alive was kept in barns or even in the lower rooms of houses, sharing warmth with the people who owned them. The smell of a winter village was partly the smell of animals kept close. Cattle and pigs and chickens are warm-bodied creatures, and their presence in the lower part of a house or in a barn attached directly to the living quarters contributed heat. Not much, but some, and in the depths of winter, some was not nothing. The peasant who could hear his cow breathing in the dark below his sleeping loft was not simply a picturesque historical figure. He was a man who knew that the cow was still alive, that its warmth was still present, and that spring was therefore still possible. Village roads in winter were transformed. Mud froze into hard ridges and valleys that made walking painful and wheeled transport nearly impossible. But when sufficient snow fell, everything changed again. Sleds moved easily over snow-covered ground, and winter became paradoxically the best season for transporting heavy loads, logs, grain, stone, because the frozen ground and the snow bore weight that the mud of other seasons would not. In Russia and much of Eastern Europe, this winter transport was essential. The great rivers froze solid enough to bear horse teams. Merchant routes that were impassable for most of the year became reliable highways of ice. For communities that might otherwise be isolated for weeks by spring mud or autumn flooding, the hard freeze was in some ways a liberation, a brief, cold opening of the world. But that same freezing could also be a catastrophe. Rivers that flooded when they thawed too quickly, livestock that died when the cold lasted past the point that the stored fodder could reach, grain that rotted or was eaten by rats in a poorly sealed granary. Winter in the village was not only managed discomfort, it was also the season of risk, of watching the provisions and the weather and the condition of the animals and calculating with the quiet anxiety of the experienced whether everything was going to hold. Certain nights in midwinter had a particular quality that people across many cultures have tried to capture. The night of the winter solstice, the longest night, had something to it that was recognized as meaningful even before it was given religious significance. It was the night when darkness was at its fullest, when the cold was deepest, when the sense of having come to the furthest point was strongest. After this night the light would begin to return, slowly, imperceptibly at first, 1 minute more each day. That return of light was not simply a calendar fact, it was felt. People in northern latitudes living by natural light experienced the shortening and lengthening of days in their bodies, in their energy levels, their sleep patterns, their mood. The solstice mattered because darkness was a real daily experience, not a theoretical one. Light, when it returned, was genuinely welcomed. There is a persistent and rather charming myth about winter in pre-modern societies, that it was a time of rest, of sitting by the fire while the world lay frozen outside. In reality, winter was simply a season of different work, and in many ways it was harder work than the rest of the year, because it was work done in cold and darkness and with fewer resources. Consider the woodcutter. In the weeks before winter deepened and throughout its duration, someone in every rural household had to ensure the wood supply. This meant going out in the cold, often in snow, with an axe, felling trees, sectioning them, splitting the sections into pieces small enough to carry and burn, loading those pieces onto a cart or sled, hauling them to the house or barn, stacking them under cover so they stayed dry, carrying them inside in loads throughout the day. This was not occasional work, it was continuous. A cold house burned through wood at a pace that required constant replenishment. The sound of winter work outdoors has its own texture, the rhythm of an axe hitting wood, the grunt of effort, the creak of snow underfoot. the loaded breathing of exertion in cold air, fingers that went numb and had to be tucked under the arms to recover feeling, boots that were wet from snow and heavy with mud and never quite dried overnight, the particular sensation of cold metal against bare skin. Inside, women's winter work was organized differently. In a colonial American household, the preservation of food and the production of textiles consumed most of the indoor winter hours. Candles had to be made, hundreds of them dipped in tallow in long, painstaking batches in the autumn to carry the household through the dark months. In many communities, this was a task done collectively, women gathering at one house or another to share the labor and the conversation. Spinning occupied many winter hours. Wool sheared in the summer had been cleaned and carded, and was now ready to be spun into thread. Hours and hours of sitting at a wheel, feeding fibers through the fingers, maintaining an even tension, watching the bobbin fill. The wheel's sound, a low, continuous hum, slightly varied by the spinner's rhythm, was one of the characteristic sounds of a winter interior. It is the sound of productive time being turned against the darkness. Food preparation in winter was a careful negotiation between the preserved and the fresh. The cellar held root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, that had been stored in sand or straw since autumn. The smokehouse held cured pork and smoked fish. The pantry held dried beans, stored oats and barley and corn, pickled vegetables, hard cheese. Every meal was assembled from these resources, with the knowledge that they had to last until the first greens of spring, which might still be 4 months away. Winter cooking had a particular set of smells and textures that came from this dependence on preserved foods. Salt-cured meat boiled slowly with roots and herbs produced a broth that was nourishing and rich and slightly salty. Grain porridge, oats or barley cooked with water or milk, was the daily staple of many households, appearing at breakfast and sometimes at supper too. Hard bread made from stored grain, dried fruit cooked soft in a pot of water with spices. These were not dramatic meals. They were practical ones, built around what was available, made warm and filling by the fire that cooked them. In medieval Europe, the keeping of livestock through winter was itself a significant logistical task. Animals had to be fed from stored hay and fodder. Their water troughs had to be broken of ice each morning. They needed to be mucked out, their bedding replaced, their health watched. A farmer who lost his ox to a winter illness did not simply suffer an inconvenience. He might lose the ability to plough in spring, which meant losing a crop, which could mean a very dangerous following winter. All of this work, the wood, the spinning, the cooking, the animals, happened against a backdrop of limited light. In the depth of winter, usable daylight might be 6 or 7 hours. Everything that required good visibility had to be done in that window. Everything else was done by fire and candle, or not done at all. What this means is that winter days, despite their shortness, were not lazy. They were compressed, all the necessary outdoor work packed into the available light, all the indoor work spread through the long firelit evenings. There was rarely a sense that time was being wasted. Time in winter was precious, and the cold made people efficient in the way that any real pressure makes people efficient. Winter did not affect everyone equally. It never has. But in the centuries before modern heating, the gap between winter as managed inconvenience and winter as bodily endurance was wider than we might easily imagine. In an English manor house of the 15th century, a prosperous landowner and his family had resources against the cold that their tenants could not approach. Their beds had curtains, their chambers had fireplaces, tended by servants. They had wool and fur and imported cloth in abundance. The fur-lined robe was not a luxury item, but a practical garment worn by anyone who could afford it, indoors as well as out. Their food supply was diverse and generous: preserved meats, imported spices, dried fruits, good wine, stored wheat rather than barley. Their servants made sure that fires were lit before the family entered a room, that warming pans were prepared before they went to bed, that wood was plentiful and dry. Their tenants in their small stone or timber cottages had a single room or two, one hearth, wool clothing, not fur, practical, heavy, but not as warm. Less abundant food, more reliance on grain and salt meat and what could be stored in a small cellar. No servants to tend the fire. Everyone in the household tended it, including the children. No warming pan unless they made do with heated stones. Their beds were curtained perhaps with cloth that had been repurposed from other uses or not curtained at all. Across the Atlantic in colonial Virginia of the early 18th century, the disparity was sharper still. The plantation owner's house had multiple fireplaces and rooms devoted to different functions: a parlor for receiving visitors, a separate bedroom suite with curtained beds, a kitchen building removed from the main house to reduce fire risk, and incidentally removing the primary source of warmth from the dwelling rooms. The enslaved men and women who worked the plantation lived in conditions that the historical record describes with uncomfortable specificity. One-room log cabins, as many as 8 people in a single structure, pallets on dirt floors, minimal bedding, insufficient clothing. These are facts, stated simply because they are part of what winter was. Winter revealed these conditions in a way that summer could somewhat conceal. In winter, insufficient clothing was not a social observation. It was a physical reality that affected the health and survival of the body. Insufficient bedding meant genuinely cold nights, not merely uncomfortable ones. Insufficient fuel meant a fire that struggled against the cold and sometimes lost. In the cities of Victorian Britain, the contrast between wealth and poverty in winter was visible in the streets. Wealthy families who kept good fires and wore heavy clothing moved through the city with relative ease. The poor, dock workers, seamstresses, crossing sweepers, the children who sold newspapers in the cold, faced the winter in inadequate coats, often with wet feet, with no warm room to return to at midday. The coal fire that kept a wealthy household comfortable was the same fuel that the poor could not afford enough of. The warmth was present. It simply was not evenly distributed. For the elderly poor in any era, winter was often the most dangerous season. Cold, combined with poor nutrition and the cumulative wear of a hard life, was frequently what ended lives in February and March that might have lasted longer in better conditions. Medieval church records show a spike in deaths in the late winter months in years of severe cold or food shortage, a pattern that was recognized by contemporaries even when they did not have the language of public health to describe it. None of this is presented here to make the documentary grim. It is presented because it is true, and because to understand what winter felt like before modern heating, we need to understand it for all of the people who lived it, not only for the ones who were comfortable. The cosy fireside of the well-appointed home and the cold loft of the labourer's cottage were both part of the same winter. They were both real. Not everything about winter was hardship. Some of it was celebration. Some of it was the deliberate making of warmth in response to cold, the conscious decision to light more candles than you strictly needed, to gather more people than the work required, to mark the darkness with fire and food and company. The winter festivals of the pre-modern world share a common logic that transcends any particular religion or culture. They happen in the darkest weeks of the year, and they all involve light. Candles, bonfires, torches, lanterns. Every winter celebration in the northern world is, at some level, an act of defiance against darkness. You light a candle not because the candle makes much difference to the temperature of the room, but because the act of lighting it changes the quality of the darkness. It makes the darkness a backdrop rather than an environment. It turns the room from a dark place with a small warm spot into a lit place with deep shadows. In Scandinavia, the feast of Saint Lucia was celebrated in the darkest days of December with a procession of light, a young woman in white with a crown of candles, walking through the darkness of the household, bringing light to the sleepers before dawn. The image is beautiful, but it is also practical. It said that light was coming, that the darkness was not permanent, that the household was still intact and moving through the winter together. In medieval and early modern England, the 12 days of Christmas were partly a feast and partly a social contract. The wealthy were expected to open their halls to their tenants and provide food and ale and warmth. It was a moment when the hierarchies of daily life were acknowledged, if not suspended, and when the great fireplace of the manor hall became, briefly, a public resource rather than a private one. The smell of a great hall at Christmas, roasting meat, mulled ale, beeswax candles if the household could afford them, rushes on the floor, and the sweat and damp wool of many bodies would have been overwhelming and magnificent. The beeswax candle is worth pausing on. For most households, candles were tallow, made from rendered animal fat, cheap, serviceable, and slightly smelly, with a slightly yellowish, slightly greasy light. Beeswax candles burned cleaner, brighter, and without the heavy animal fat smell. They cost considerably more. To burn beeswax candles was to announce something about your household, your means, your aspirations, your desire to make of this winter evening something better than merely adequate. Winter gatherings in rural communities were often organized around shared work that was too much for one household. Corn-husking bees in colonial America, where the long evenings of husking were made sociable with singing and storytelling and cider. Spinning bees, where women brought their wheels to a single large room and spun together through the dark hours. Log-raising parties in spring that were preceded by winter preparation. These were not merely efficient, they were culturally important, the way that communal meals are culturally important. They made the work of winter into something shared, and sharing it made it bearable. In Russia and Eastern Europe, the winter stove was a social object in a way that Western fireplaces rarely were. The great Russian pech, the traditional masonry stove that occupied a substantial portion of the main room and radiated heat for many hours after the fire had died, was large enough to sleep on. It was used for drying boots and mittens and wet clothing. It was used for keeping food warm. It was used for gathering around, for sitting on, for the intimate closeness that extreme cold encourages. A family's relationship with its stove was almost personal. What all these traditions have in common is that they turned winter from a passive ordeal into an active relationship. Instead of simply enduring the cold, people developed rituals that made the cold meaningful. The lighting of candles, the gathering of neighbors, the making of special food, the singing of songs specifically associated with this season. These were not distractions from winter. They were responses to it, ways of making the body of winter livable by filling it with intentional warmth. What does a long winter do to the mind? This is a question that the historical record answers only indirectly, through diaries and letters and the recurring patterns of folklore and custom. But the indirect evidence is consistent enough to suggest something real. That extended darkness, limited mobility, and physical cold produced a particular state of mind that was quite different from the mental experience of the rest of the year. The most obvious effect was a narrowing of the world. In summer, the world was wide. You could travel, visit, work outdoors, cover distance on foot or horseback. In winter, particularly in northern latitudes, the world contracted to the radius of what you could reach in the daylight hours while also completing the essential work of the day. For many people, this meant the village and the immediately surrounding fields. For some, it meant the house and the yard. The world became smaller, and smaller worlds produce a different kind of thinking. In Scandinavia, Finland, and the far north of Russia, where winter darkness is extreme, where the sun rises at 10 in the morning and sets at 2 in the afternoon, or does not rise at all for weeks at a time, the psychological effects were recognized and addressed with specific cultural practices. The emphasis on interior light, on gathering, on warmth as a social good rather than just a physical one. These were not merely comfortable habits. They were adaptive strategies against the very real human tendency toward depression and withdrawal in the long dark. The modern concept of seasonal affective disorder, the clinical depression that some people experience in winter months, understood to be related to reduced light exposure, is simply the medicalized version of something that has been felt for as long as people have lived in northern latitudes. The Old Norse word for the winter depression was sometimes described obliquely, a heaviness, a tendency to sit too long without moving, a loss of the capacity for joy that was recognized as a seasonal condition rather than a permanent character flaw. Against this, people developed what worked: fire, light, company, music, food, celebration, the deliberate engineering of warmth and brightness. The Scandinavian concept of hygge, the Danish and Norwegian word that has been somewhat overused in recent years but which describes a very real and ancient thing, is ultimately a winter survival strategy. It is the recognition that warmth and coziness and togetherness are not merely pleasant but necessary, that the human animal needs certain conditions to maintain its psychological health in the dark months, and that those conditions must be actively created. There was also, paradoxically, something that people found valuable in winter's contraction. The indoor turning inward that winter enforced could be, when the provisions were adequate and the household was intact, a time of unusual intimacy and thoughtfulness. Letters written by educated people in earlier centuries often describe winter as a time of reading and reflection, the season when the press of outdoor work released them to spend long evenings with books, correspondence, and their own thoughts. The fire helped this. There is something about firelight that is more conducive to certain kinds of thinking than electric light. It is dynamic, always slightly moving, casting varying shadows, producing a room that is in constant, gentle motion. It creates a focus. You do not look away from a fire the way you look away from a light bulb. A fire holds you, draws the attention toward it, produces a meditative quality in the mind of the person watching it. People who sat by fires through long winter evenings were, in a sense, practicing a kind of attention that is harder to practice now. The task before them was simple and finite: tend the fire, spin the wool, read the book, talk to the person beside you. There were no other options. The darkness outside and the cold at the edge of the room made the small, warm circle the whole world for that evening. And within that small world, you could go quite deep. Winter also enforced a certain patience. Spring was not coming soon. The weather was not going to change tomorrow. You were in this, and the most useful thing you could do was accept that you were in it and work within it. This is not resignation. It is something more active than that, a kind of calibration to the scale of the season. You cannot fight a northern winter. You can prepare for it, survive it, and find what it has to offer. Many of the people who lived this way would have said, if asked, that they did not merely endure winter, they understood it. Let us gather what we have seen so far and hold it together for a moment. Across many centuries and many geographies, from Roman Italy to colonial Virginia, from the Scottish Highlands to the Russian steppe, winter, before central heating, was a season organized around certain recurring facts. Cold came inside. Warmth was local, not general, and it required active, continuous labor to maintain. Darkness was real and long. The body was more present in its needs, more aware of temperature, more dependent on food and fire and clothing, more vulnerable to the cold, that everything in the built environment was trying, with partial success, to keep out. The houses of this world were not uniformly cold and miserable. Many of them were genuinely comfortable in ways that their inhabitants appreciated and worked hard to maintain. The Welsh farmhouse, with its smoky peat fire and the low beams above and the dog on the hearth, and the smell of lanolin from the freshly washed wool, this was a cosy place. The Dutch townhouse of the 17th century, with its enclosed bed and its thick curtains and its stove of painted tile, this was a warm and pleasant place. The colonial kitchen on a December evening, with its vast hearth and the smells of dinner and the sound of the spinning wheel, this was a rich domestic space. But the comfort was bounded by the fire, and the fire was bounded by the wood, and the wood was bounded by the season, the forest, and the labor of the household. You were always at most 1 or 2 steps from the cold. If the fire went out overnight, you woke in a room that was close to the outdoor temperature. If the wood ran short, you made choices about which rooms to heat and which to abandon. If the cold was exceptional, the kind of winter that froze the Thames in London or buried the roads of the Rhineland, even a well-provisioned household felt the edge of it. The ancient Romans had a phrase, omnia vincit, which means something like all things are conquered by it. They applied it to love, but it might equally be applied to winter in the pre-modern world. Winter was the context within which everything else happened. You planted in relation to when winter ended and when it began again. You planned your food stores in relation to how long winter might last. You organized your house in relation to where the heat could be maintained. You organized your day in relation to how much usable light winter allowed. Winter set the terms, and everything else negotiated with those terms. There were also things that we have lost by escaping from that world. The particular quality of warmth that is felt against cold is not the same as the ambient temperature of a heated room. When you have been genuinely cold and then come in from the outside and approach a fire, the warmth is physical in a way that is almost indescribable. It enters the hands and the face first, then spreads, and there is a moment of pure bodily gratitude that is not available to someone who has never been that cold. The people who lived in those houses knew that feeling every day. It was ordinary for them, but it was not nothing. The smell of a wood fire in a cold room is a smell that bypasses the mind and goes directly to something older. It triggers something that was learned so long ago that it has become instinct. Fire means safety. Fire means warmth. Fire means the night is being held back. Modern people burning wood fires for atmosphere rather than necessity still feel this. They feel it because it was coded into the human body over a very long time in exactly the kind of houses and winters we have been describing. The world before central heating was colder, more physically demanding, and more dangerous than ours. It was also more intimate with the physical world, more responsive to weather, more dependent on the natural cycles of light and cold and warmth, more organized around the body's actual needs. This was not a better world in any straightforward sense, but it was a real world, lived by real people, and it is worth understanding on its own terms.